So as many of you already know, the theme for the Michael Davis Lecture Series this year is the financialization of health, which refers to the growth of the financial sector and its increasing entanglement within our health system. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Victor Roy as this week's speaker. Dr. Roy is currently a VA scholar in the National Clinician Scholars Program at Yale. He completed his residency training in family medicine at Boston University and his medical degree from Northwestern University, as well as his doctorate in sociology from the University of Cambridge. He also co-founded and served as executive director of Globe Med, a network of students on university campuses, and partnered with communities around the world to tackle poverty and health inequality. His new book, Capitalizing a Cure, takes readers into the struggle over a medical breakthrough to investigate the power of finance in business, biomedicine, and public health. I think it's fair to say this book does an exceptional job examining the different dimensions of financialization and how they relate to pharmaceutical strategies and practices as observed in the case of hepatitis C medication. Leveraging a set of analytical tools from political economy, economic sociology, and science and technology studies, Dr. Roy has offered a critical account of the expanding role of the financial sector and what it means for patients, payers, and public health broadly. This book comes at a pivotal moment when the nation is already grappling with how to price drugs and how to curtail years of skyrocketing drug prices, while pharmaceutical companies continue to see huge profit margins and have embedded themselves in governmental policy, health services research, and public health funding. As a sociologist and physician, Dr. Roy is uniquely poised to examine financialization and its implications in our health system. And so with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Roy, and I'm grateful for all of you coming here today.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And it's really great to be here and be able to be part of this lecture series on the financialization of health. And so thank you to Joe Brush and Colleen Grogan and Keith Brown and everyone that kind of made this lecture series possible. As Joe mentioned, I'm a physician and a sociologist. And you might be wondering like how I came to this topic of studying finance and financialization. I'll just tell you a brief bit. When I was an undergrad at Northwestern and went to medical school, I was really interested in the HIV/AIDS access movement that really was able to fight for and struggle over access to medicines during the 2000s, both in the US but also internationally. And as I was starting my doctoral work, I was struck by the fact that here we were after all these lessons around pricing, valuation, access to medicines with a new treatment, this time for hepatitis C, with some pretty profound struggles and debates happening around how to price, value, and access these medications. And so it took me far afield from where I thought the study was going to go. I didn't expect to study finance and financialization, but I think that's one of the privileges of doing sociological work where you follow the question, it leads you to this analysis of, or led me to this analysis of finance. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of a historical allusion. Because this is a named lecture series after Michael M. Davis, who was thinking about public finance and the structure and organization of care in the earlier part of the 20th century. Well, at that time, there was an economist, an Austrian economist, not named Hayek, Joseph Schumpeter, who was really interested in thinking about private finance and the way that private finance fueled, in his view, innovation and dynamic change in the economy. And he argued that banks or money markets were the headquarters of capitalism. And in his view, capitalism was a kind of form of economy in which innovation was fueled through borrowed money. Banks would take deposits and make loans, and people could take those loans and pursue new products, services, and markets. Now, fast forward to today, and I would argue, and I'm going to argue, that the financial sector and the way it's organized and its relationship to innovation is very different from the one Joseph Schumpeter was imagining in the first part of the 20th century. and he would find what we have today a bit more unfamiliar. And I'm going to make the argument, I think the task before myself that I have in front of you all is to try and connect it to the liver. And that that actually understanding this actually helps us understand whether people have healthy livers or have hepatitis C. So we're going to try and make financialization a little bit more concrete at the level of the liver. So we'll see if I succeed, and you guys can give me feedback at the end. So I'm going to set the scene for the book. Then I'm going to share 3 kind of analytical frames that I think are useful for dissecting financialization when it comes to the pharmaceutical sector and biomedical innovation. But I hope that as you think about your own areas of health and health policy, that you find some links, that the analytical frames might be useful even in other parts of what you're examining. And then we're going to discuss some potential futures of how we might proceed in this time of financialization and what it might mean for innovation, for public health, and what it might mean for all of us. Okay, so that's the plan. I'm going to start the story. It's June of 2015. I'm doing some field work at this clinic in the safety net in South LA. And at this federally qualified health center, they have 70 patients that have hepatitis C that they've diagnosed and would benefit from treatment. And there's a lot of hope in the air because just about 18 months or so before, there was approved at that time a new curative treatment for these patients. But in speaking with the health workers, there was also a lot of frustration and anger because so far, to that point, they'd only been able to get one person on the treatment. And to explain kind of the controversy, I need to take you into hepatitis C a little bit, give you a little bit of background, and then we'll be able to kind of describe what the main controversy was. So what is hepatitis C? It's a deadly virus that injures the liver. It's transmitted primarily via the blood. Injecting drug use currently is the leading way of transmitting it. And in the time before we did screening of blood transfusions was another way. And so this really does impact structurally marginalized populations. So people that inject drugs, those that are in the incarcerated, and this comes into play later on in the story. It injures the liver over time, potentially leading to cirrhosis, so a distortion of the liver tissue, end-stage liver disease. It can lead to liver cancer and death. And it can be a very ugly death, right? Where you don't know who you are because of the way it alters your mental status. You can bleed and have a really distended belly. It's a really kind of gruesome end for those that have end-stage liver disease. And the older treatments for these patients were really toxic. You needed to take weekly injectable treatments using something called interferon. And you'd need to take this treatment for a year, and you weren't necessarily guaranteed that you'd get better. The cure rates were far lower than 50% in a lot of the patient populations in studies. And it's a disease that affects a lot of people in the US, over 2 million, and globally, from 2016 data, about 70 million, according to the WHO. So along comes these sofosbuvir-based medicines. That's the main compound, sofosbuvir. They're approved in December of 2013, the first series of them. The manufacturer, Gilead Sciences, then rolls out a series of improvements where this sofosbuvir-based regimen can treat all the different varieties or genotypes of hepatitis C. And the treatments offer cure rates north of 90%, which is really unheard of, right, in contemporary medicine to have such a big medical breakthrough. But the applause for science gets met with contention and consternation because the prices are set north of $90,000. Right? This is a Bloomberg Business Week front cover. It's a treatment that cures the disease after just taking the treatment daily for 3 months. So another beautiful thing. You don't need to take this as a lifelong treatment. 3 months, and you can eliminate the virus. So it becomes dubbed the $1,000 a day pill. And so this, of course, leads to a series of political fights. And state Medicaid agencies, where a lot of patients are covered with hepatitis C, face a struggle, right? With the large patient populations with a high price, of course, they have to make decisions about how much they can use in terms of their funding to cover this drug. And so the state Medicaid agencies decide to ration the treatment, where you have to have advanced liver disease in order to qualify. And even then, in order to qualify, you have to go through a series of lab tests, meet sobriety requirements, kind of punitive requirements to kind of basically control costs for the agencies. And so in the first year, state Medicaid programs spend $1 billion to cover only 2.4% of the population that's on Medicaid. This also catches the eye of the US Senate Committee. Senators Wyden and Grassley, a bipartisan group, end up investigating Gilead Sciences because Medicare, one of the other major public funders of medicines, ends up spending a lot of money to cover patients on this treatment. Something like $13 billion goes towards this one treatment in the year after launch. As this controversy is playing out, what's really grabs my attention is that there's an interesting set of justifications for the pricing. Right, you might have heard typically drug companies make the argument that the prices of their drugs are linked to how much it costs to do research and development. And the idea that because research and development is really costly, companies are able to have monopoly protections through patents to be able to charge high prices to recoup that research and development investment. But there's a different argument that's being made with hepatitis C. And that argument is that because these are curative treatments, they have a huge value to society. They avert liver transplants. They avert hospitalizations. And there's such a big breakthrough compared to the previous treatments that we as a society should be willing to pay for it. So this is the kind of headline we start getting in places like Vox, right? Sarah Cliff, who's done a lot of investigative journalism and now is the New York Times, she talks to a bunch of health economists and comes up with the conclusion that, you know what, this is a good deal based on the fact that this is a curative treatment. Now, this was kind of an interesting puzzle to me because I think the implication here was that our best treatments, our medical breakthroughs, should by definition be the most expensive, right? Because we should be willing to pay more for better health. And I wanted to try and understand where that logic was coming from and what it kind of meant for biomedical innovation and for public health. And what's interesting is that this kind of logic echoed what the pharmaceutical industry was saying, particularly Gilead Sciences, their executive, says, price is the wrong subject. Value should be the discussion, right? Trying to shift our attention to really focus on the fact that these are incredibly valuable treatments. So this is where the analysis of finance and financialization comes in, because I realized the more and more I looked at this, that where some of these debates, how they would be constructed, without an analysis of finance and financialization, it was really hard to unpick what was happening. As you've probably already heard in this lecture series, broadly speaking, financialization is about the rising power of financial sector actors, motives, and logics in our economy and in our society. And for those that might be unacquainted, very briefly, and in a broad way, this does come really out of economic history and sociological literatures. This is Greta Krippner's work as a sociologist describing how in the latter part of the 20th century, really even starting in the post-war era, how the financial sector starts becoming a bigger and bigger part of our economy due to a set of policy decisions made by politicians to give financial markets more power. As we get later into the 20th century, the financial sector accounts for a larger share of overall profits in our economy when you compare it to manufacturing and service sectors. And this kind of growth of the financial sector ends up impacting businesses that aren't even involved directly in financial services. So companies that are typically oriented around, let's say, manufacturing or product development are oriented more and more around financial markets, share prices, trying to gain short-term growth and distributing that growth to shareholders. And this is Gerald Davis's work kind of describing what the implications of this are for the American corporation. Now, you might be wondering what all of this has to do with drug pricing and biomedical innovation. So that's part of the link I try and make in this book, Capitalizing a Cure, is how does financialization shape the way the drugs are made, priced, and valued? Kind of try and open up the black box and make these links. And the way I do this is by really doing a sociological case study of these sofosbuvir-based medicines. And so I can talk more about the methods in the Q&A. I'll just very briefly say that the general approach was a historical one where I traced the process behind the making and developing of these drugs and the policy struggle from the mid-1990s into just a few years ago. The conceptual sources, like Joe already mentioned, I drew on a set of literatures that are kind of adjacent to health policy, but I think are actually useful to lean on in this case to then kind of critically look at what was happening in some of the policy debates. So science and technology studies, political economy, and the economic and medical sociology evaluation. And the empirical and data sources, I triangulated between a bunch of different sources. I'm just gonna name two that I think might be interesting. One are the earnings calls transcripts between firm executives and Wall Street. They're a gold mine because this is how companies are communicating what they believe about themselves currently and in the future directly to Wall Street. There's a lot of information there that I don't think social scientists and health policy researchers take advantage enough of. But that's one source of data. The other one was the US Senate investigation, which happened to come out in like the third year of my PhD with 1,500 pages of internal corporate documents. Which was obviously very useful to understanding some of these dynamics and to really see what was happening on the inside. So I'm gonna try and distill a lot of what I talk about in the book. It's about 140 pages and it's available open access, so I encourage you guys to check it out. What I'm trying to distill, huh? Okay, yeah, you can buy it. It's a paperback. It's like 34 bucks. But you know, I wanted to make this in the spirit of this project, make it openly available, right? I didn't want to monetize it, just to be consistent. But the analytical frames that I use here, one is really focusing on this idea of assets and how knowledge becomes turned into financial assets, tracing that process. Thinking about value, right? And this is a frame value or word that comes up all the time in health policy, but understanding how it gets configured around maximizing shareholder value and what the implications there are. And then as a sociologist, we're interested in power. And here I'm interested not just in like the overt political power of lobbying and money in politics, but the way in which power operates through hegemony. And I'll explain what I mean by the creation of kind of a common sense view that helps this entire financialized process kind of keep going. Okay, so we're now gonna go through each one over the next like 20 or so minutes, okay? So let's start with knowledge and financial assets. So to think a little bit about the concept of assets, first I'm just gonna tell you very briefly what the story is behind how these drugs were made, at least in the early phases. And it's a common story. It's a story that you'll find to be very familiar. Pharmasset is a company that's started by Ray Shinazi. He's a publicly funded scientist at the VA and at Emory down in Atlanta. He's gotten decades of publicly funded research on nucleoside science. And so he's got an idea to start a company that is going to focus on antiviral development based off of this publicly funded science. Pharmasset itself gets 16 grants from the National Institutes of Health in its early goings to kind of help develop their operations and strategy, but they also raise venture capital as they spin out from Emory and the VA, and ultimately become listed on NASDAQ. They use some of that money to ultimately develop this compound called sofosbuvir and enter it into, by the end of this period in 2008, into clinical studies. So I'm going to fast forward. It's 2011. Pharmasset has spent $271 million on research and development on these drugs. They don't have any products. They don't have any revenues, but they're valued at $8 billion, right? Now, it's an interesting opportunity to understand, if you want to understand financialization, it's helpful to understand where does that $8 billion valuation come from for a company that has no products or revenues and has spent $270 million on R&D. So this is where a concept of assets comes into play. And this process of assetization, right? And this is actually drawing on science and technology studies, drawing on an economist named Thorsten Veblen, who was writing in the early 20th century, analyzing industrial power. And his view was that capital is ultimately the ownership and control over assets in a community. So whoever's able to own and control assets in a community is able to have basically capital and be able to exert power in that economy. And in the case of pharmaceuticals and biomedical innovation, assets don't have to be something that's concrete like a pill. They can be things that are intangible, like knowledge. It could be tangible, right? You can have tangible assets like housing, but you can have intangible assets like knowledge. And the key is, how do you turn the ownership and control over something intangible like knowledge that hasn't been actually used to develop the product yet into a future earnings stream. Right? And that's like really critical to this entire process. And that relies on a whole set of political, legal, and economic processes that turn, in this case, socially produced, publicly funded science, hybrid with private sector involvement, into patents, right? Patents that companies like Pharmasec can monetize, that Wall Street can value. And this really accelerates in the 1980s for rules and legal changes that I describe in the book, where publicly funded science is able to be mobilized into these kinds of asset formations with biotech startups that then also have venture capital backing. Now, just to put a finer point on this idea of assets, assets have different logics actually than what we normally think of in terms of commodities, right? You'll often hear about the commodification of healthcare, and I'd actually argue that we also have the assetization of healthcare, and there's a little bit of a distinction here. Commodities, they get their value from exchange, right? You buy an iTunes track, you pay a little bit of money, you gain access to that commodity. Whereas an asset, the value comes from the ownership over that future earning stream. So that's like the musician's intellectual property over that music that is in that one track, right? And this leads to interesting kind of demand logics and pricing logics, because what happens with commodities is when you have a lot of demand for a commodity, usually that'll draw in additional producers and the prices can go down over time. But with assets, when there's a lot of demand for an asset, because of the ownership and control dynamics, it's made to be artificially scarce, right? And so the demand leads to an increase in the price. Think about housing, right? The more people that want a piece of property, you can actually drive up the price of the house. And so we see assets increasing in their valuation in the context of biotech. And I'm going to explain this in the context of Pharmasec, when there's an idea that this treatment area could be really lucrative. So where does that $8 billion valuation come from? So I'm going to go back to that here with Pharmasec. Now, part of it does come from the fact that there's maturing technology that Pharmasec has. So like I described before, there's important public funding behind the sofosbuvir-based medicines. This is a study that detailed the public funding that went behind these treatments. And this is actually really attractive to venture capitalists, right? So this is one of the venture capitalists that backs Pharmasec. He says, due to NIH funding now also going towards programs that demonstrate commercial potential, our startups are much further along by the time we invest, even though they might be still straight out of academia. And so it's important to know that part of the value creation process does actually start with, in many instances, government money. This is work by Mariana Mazzucato in a book that's become popular since 2013 or 14 in The Entrepreneurial State, in which he describes the ways in which the public sector can oftentimes take on the most uncertain, riskiest stages of an innovation process and actually help draw in private capital subsequent to that initial investment period. Of course, there's another side to where that $8 billion valuation comes from, and that's that the hepatitis C treatments that are already on the market, even though they don't necessarily lead to great treatment outcomes, are already priced north of $50,000, right? So investors know that if another treatment comes out with even better outcomes, society might be able to, or health systems might be willing to pay even more for it. And so this is just a plot from looking at the Swiss market, but actually could very well be the US market. The x-axis looking at cure rates from 0 to 100%, and each bar representing a new generation of treatment since the late 1990s. And what we see here is that for each generation of improvement in therapy, the prices go up. So the launch price for each generation sets the floor for the next set of treatments. And this equates to basically for every 1% increase in the cure rate, we get about $1,000 more in terms of the launch price. And so this kind of anticipation of downstream markets that could be really lucrative helps draw in, it is true, a series of financial actors. It actually does mobilize a group of economic actors, but they have a lot of variety in terms of how involved they are actually in the investment mechanism versus financial actors that might be more involved in trading on the share price of something. So you've got venture capitalists that are taking on a period of investment in return for hopefully an exit that they're able to make a good return on. And then you've got actors like hedge funds who later on in the process are trading on the share price, trying to buy low and sell high. One of the examples of a hedge fund involved in hepatitis C is run by this guy that you might now be familiar with, Vivek Ramaswamy. He makes most of his initial wealth actually in hepatitis C, taking out stakes in companies like Pharmaset. So he's one of the major shareholders in Pharmaset, and is able to make hundreds of millions of dollars through his stakes in a series of hepatitis C compounds. And so the main takeaway with this whole idea around assets is that, for financial actors, the focus is really on the exit. None of these actors are involved for the period of time it takes to actually develop a treatment, right? They're involved to the point where they can mitigate their risk and get out for an exit. And Pharmaset, the company's founder, Ray Shanazi, has this idea in his mind as well. He says, I coined the name. It's actually pharmaceutical assets, right? It's right in the name, Pharmaset. And the idea was to create assets that could be sold to companies. That was the initial business plan. So now I'm going to turn to the suitors, right? Who are the companies that are going to buy these assets? And look at the structural dynamics around the big pharmaceutical companies. And this is where we need to understand value and how it's configured around maximizing shareholder value. So let's look at Gilead. It's a really financially successful business by 2011. It's making a lot of money, $8 billion in revenue. It's its main treatment area is HIV, and they've got $10 billion in cash on hand. Their profit margins are handsome, over 30%. Wall Street is kind of worried because their share price is doing this. It's kind of horizontal. There isn't much growth. This is a Bloomberg business commentary looking at Gilead. As its earlier galloping growth begins to slow, investors are starting to wonder what Gilead plans to do for a second act. So Gilead's feeling the heat. How is it going to grow? And to kind of try and understand what position Gilead's in, I'm going to just walk you through how capital kind of flows through these publicly traded companies in a very simplified model, but just to kind of help understand some of the dynamics at play here. So you've got a company like Gilead. They make, in this case, technologies. In this case, HIV is already. They capture a share of the value they create through payments from governments and from households through the insurance premiums we pay. They can reinvest some of that money in research and development, manufacturing, or workers, or they can distribute that capital to shareholders, who are the executives of the company, asset managers, pension funds. I want to key in on this part right here, because there's this idea that has been advanced since the 1970s, 1980s, that really the purpose of the corporation is to maximize the flow of capital to shareholders. And this idea is that corporate shareholders, more than corporate managers, can efficiently allocate that money and capital across the economy, whereas corporate executives might spend it more wastefully. And so the focus of corporations should really be to distribute capital to shareholders and focus on their share price, because this is the way that shareholders can know which are the companies that have the most potential to grow in the future. Because that's what a share price ultimately is. Which companies have the greatest potential for future growth? So it's not just that profits matter, right? It's which companies are going to grow their profits the most. So this is a distinction I like to make. It's not just about profits, it's about growth and profits. And that actually matters a lot when we're talking about research and development. I'm going to get to that. Now, how companies distribute this capital to shareholders? There's one of two major ways. You've got dividends, which probably all are familiar with, where shareholders get some capital for the shares that they own. And then since 1982, when the SEC changed its rules and made this maneuver legal, this thing called a share buyback, where companies can buy their own shares off the stock market. And why do they do this? Well, it reduces the denominator in the earnings per share ratio, right? And that increases that ratio. It makes their stock look more valuable, and it's a way of increasing their share price. And so this is a maneuver. These sets of maneuvers are very much a big part of the pharmaceutical industry strategy. One study looked at the pharmaceutical companies on the S&P 500 in this 2012 to 2021 period, and found that those companies spent $87 billion more on buybacks and dividends than they spent on research and development. So and this is part of why there's an idea by a group of economists that have posited that actually maximizing shareholder value is actually a strategy of value extraction, because it drives executives to pursue short-term profits rather than long-term investments, partly because executive compensation is so much of a big part of executive compensation is share ownership, that actually drives part of that short-term kind of profit motive is about trying to charge high prices that corporations can charge the public through their control in concentrated markets, and that it fundamentally rewards financial actors that don't actually even invest in a company's value creating capabilities, right? A company like Gilead isn't going to Wall Street and saying, hey, we need your capital to build this factory, because they already have retained capital from the sales that they've had on drugs. And so there's, particularly with share buybacks, actually even some bipartisan concern. These are three men that don't agree on much, who have expressed their concerns over share buybacks. And this kind of rose particularly during the pandemic, because there was so much government aid flowing to private entities. And there was concern that public money was basically being turned around and being used on share buybacks. So let's come back to the pharmaceutical sector and biomedical innovation. Is shareholder growth compatible with research and development? We know, and the drug companies will tell us, it takes a long time to develop a new treatment. But they also have this imperative to deliver growth in short time horizons. And this is work from Kaushik Sundararajan, who's actually at U of Chicago, is an anthropologist, wrote this terrific book called Pharmacracy, where he analyzes the pharmaceutical sector and looks at kind of the structural positioning of the large publicly traded companies. And he finds that because of this imperative to grow and deliver growth to shareholders at a clip of about 10% every year, against this backdrop of having to take long-term risks in research and development, it's actually disincentivized to actually do that, right? So actually the best way to deliver growth is for big companies to become acquisition specialists, right? And so this is one of the main ways that they can deliver growth to shareholders. And if you look at Gilead Sciences, the way they talk about themselves to Wall Street, and I can walk you through their corporate transactions, this is the way they see themselves. Gilead's CEO saying, we typically like things where we can have an impact on phase 3 and where we can accelerate those products either into the approval process or into greater indications after the approval process. So I'm going to remind you, 2011, Gilead's kind of stagnating in terms of growth, even though their profitability is over 30% in terms of profit rates, margins, and they have about $8 billion in revenue. But the company goes out and buys Pharmaset for $11 billion. Now that valuation, $11 billion, has nothing to do with how much money Pharmaset has spent on research and development, right? $271 million. This has everything to do with what Gilead thinks the hepatitis C market will be in the future. And so I'm going to fast forward. I'm going to get back to the pricing in the third part of the talk, but I'm going to talk a little bit about this company that ends up making $46.4 billion in 3 years off of this one treatment area. And where does this money go? Now, I can go through this plot a little bit here, where the revenues definitely jump. That blue line, a lot of that money goes to cash stockpiles for their future acquisitions. That's the orange line. And the gray line is share buybacks and dividends. Whereas that yellow line at the bottom, that's your R&D. So if you the key takeaway is that the company, after acquiring this hepatitis C drug, they spent $33 billion in terms of shareholder payouts, most of that through buybacks, $26 billion, and they spent $11 billion in R&D. So 3 times as much on shareholder payouts as on R&D. And part of that might be explained by the fact that the corporate managers, the C-suite, are major shareholders in the corporation, right? And so the five executives in Gilead in those 5 years, in those 3 years after the launch period, make over $1 billion, just these 5 individuals: the CEO, the COO, the EVP, the head of R&D, and the CFO, right? And let's just look at how the head of R&D for Gilead talks about the strategy, right? This is the head of R&D we're talking about. And as he's talking to Wall Street, he says, if you look at the last 6 years, it has been remarkable. We have done many, many deals. He names all the acquisitions. And yet we were able to return 70% of our free cash flow to shareholders. So I think this is a good way to think about the future. Now I'm just going to contrast this. It's a very different conception of the role of a pharmaceutical entity than, let's say, a post-war era version of Merck. This is a Time cover from 1952. This is George Merck, with the subtitle there being "Medicine is for people, not for profits." But Merck is, at that time, a much more integrated company, doing the whole kind of research and development up into manufacturing, right? Whereas I've just contrasted with the kind of conception that Gilead has of itself and the function it plays in the innovation process. And so, I'm going to make the provocative claim here, drawing on Mariana Mazzucato's work here again, that we have made it easier for some to call themselves value creators and in the process extract value. Now, how does this happen? I'm going to make the claim here in this third part that we have to look at power, and power, again, not in the kind of overt political lobbying sense, though that's a really important part of the story, but power in the form of hegemony. And this, I'm going to draw on Kaushik Sundararajan's work in Pharmacracy again, where he draws on this idea from the social theorist Antonio Gramsci, hegemony being kind of the establishment of a new common sense. And what is this common sense? So let's use the pricing debates as part of the story, as the story here. How does Gilead set their price? So this is just directly from their internal corporate documents. They say that they basically bill directly on the current hepatitis C prices, and they put a little value premium, right? Because the treatments are better, they can charge a premium to the public for that. They do know that because there's large numbers of people that can benefit, times multiplied by these high price points, they might face opposition. So they do a heat map. They actually map out the stakeholders, payers to the public in general, and they map out how far up they can go in terms of the upward bounds of prices that they can charge the public. And they basically model out where they might face resistance. They even model out the likelihood of a letter from Congress, a likelihood of a congressional hearing, over their pricing of Sofosbuvir. Now they have an interesting, I would argue, set of unwitting, potentially, allies in this. And that is actually in some parts of the health policy community. In that the argument is also being made in the literature, right, that these are really cost-effective treatments. And they are, because of how much of a benefit they're providing society, that even at a high price point, they are deemed in study after study after study to be cost effective. And so this is kind of the conclusion, right, that the health policy community in many corners are making. I want to paint a monolithic picture, but this is a predominant and prevailing view. The most important thing to remember about cost effectiveness is that something that is really expensive can still be cost effective if it is really, really effective. And these drugs are very, very effective. And this is a position by an expression by Mark Roberts, who's a professor at Pittsburgh. And so I wanted to kind of trace, where does this come from, right? And how do we understand this economic valuation? And so a book that, if you're interested in these topics, I'd recommend you take a look at, by another sociologist, anthropologist, Drugs for Life, by Joseph Dumet, How Pharmaceutical Companies Define Our Health, in which he looks at the post-war era and the emergence of all these kind of epistemic practices that are foundational, bedrock to contemporary biomedicine, right? Long-term clinical studies of natural history, clinical trials, clinical epidemiology, pharmacoeconomic studies, that are really important ways of basically measuring the impact that new therapies can have on not just individuals, but on populations. And he says that this is able to help kind of construct a transformation in the way we think of disease and treatment, not just treating felt illness, right? I'm feeling sick, I'm gonna go and get a drug, but that health systems are gonna be able to use treatment to treat a statistical illness, right? And by being able to treat a population, they can be able to garner some kind of economic value of this kind of future health. Right, in hepatitis C, it's this idea of averted healthcare costs in the future, averted liver transplants, things like that. And these are actually really important practices about how we allocate capital. There's a deep rationality embedded in this that I argue is a really important part of what we do in thinking about how we allocate resources in society.